'Tis but a scratch. Hi everyone. So for this devlog, I worked on a 2D particle system. It has a lot of opportunity, I think, for improvement in the future, but yeah, as of right now, it still has a very programmer art feel. But yeah, for this prototype, I think it's fine. And it's quite a bit flexible actually, which I'll show in the design later. So I'm going to show some of the iterations and some of the progression to get from nothing to something. And after, I'll go over the design briefly. So this was my first try, and you can see that the particles are to the right of the screen and they're not doing much. Still to the right of the screen, but at least now they're animated. And then I moved the particles from screen space to world space, but the rotation is still off. I then fixed the rotation, and just for fun, I wanted to see what a million particles at about 100,000 particles per second look like. And I forget why I did this. And then I got the particles emitting from a point on the sword. I then needed to emit the particles in a volume. This volume is just a bounding box around the sword. However, you will notice the volume here is axis aligned with the world, which I actually did not expect to happen. I'll explain a bit later why that is and how I fixed it. After the volume was fixed, I still had an issue with not undoing the camera's rotation. I fixed the rotation, but then there was a slight issue where the particles were sticking to the sword. Now the particles don't stick any longer, but there was this weird bursting effect, which ended up being a one-line fix. I then added alpha blending and an initial and end color that will be mixed based on the alpha value, and it's starting to look like something I would expect. I then changed some of the properties around, and here is a water sword. I think the easiest way to show the design is to show an example of how it's used. I'm going to avoid going into the intricate details as I think those are a bit less exciting. So this example is of the flaming sword. So the first thing we have defined here are the particle props. So these are the properties that are used to give the, I guess you could say, the qualities of the particle when it's emitted. This first part here is the x, y, and z components of a 3D vector that will be combined with the speed to create the velocity of the particle. And you'll notice that these are inclusive ranges. I like this because it gives flexibility in that we can set a value to be constant, like for example, the y direction is always going to be 1, or we can add a little variety. For example, the x and z go from negative 0.01 to 0.01, which gives a little bit of wiggle in the x and z direction. The next couple properties are as you'd expect, which are size and the life, which varies. So life is interesting because this is what determines the alpha or the blending. Also, it's the interpolation weight for the colors. Now in the future, perhaps I'll allow a function to be passed in, so it's not a linear interpolation, but I think for now, yeah, it looks fine. And next we have the particle squirter. So this has a squirt rate and the total particle count. So this gets used to create the VBOs for the instance rendering, and also has a particle volume. So in this case, we have just the bounding box of the sword. So this piece here, and this will create the volume that we see. I also support a sphere, a point, and something else. But for now, just rec is fine. And then I call build, and yeah, this actually puts everything together and creates all the buffers and all of that. And then after, it gets added to a component and gets added to the universe. Now the more interesting part, I think, is the particle volume. So if I draw a volume here, now I'm drawing this in 2 dimensions, but it's actually in 3 dimensions. And the original idea that I had and what I had tried, that you saw in the video that I said I would explain more, is I would pass in an x, y, and z, min, max, and along these axes, I would pick some value, right? And this would end up being the position of the particle. And it's already in world space, so it ends up working out well. But the issue is, and I don't know why I didn't realize that, is if you pick along these axes, they're actually the world space axes. So when the sword rotates, let's say 45 degrees, let's say I draw the sword like, I don't know, let's draw the sword like this, right? You end up with a bounding box that looks like this, and the particles end up being picked and fill this area. Again, this is because it's aligned with the world axis. So there's a video I did earlier around collision detection and OBBs versus AABBs and all that good stuff. And this is the same concept. So now what I have to do is not use the world space XYZ, but actually use a local space of the volume. So if I draw the volume here, let's say another volume, then the coordinates, right? So these coordinates here, left, bottom, back, front, top, right, are relative to this volume. So they're not in world space yet. So this is part of the, I guess, game specific logic. So this becomes less generic because you have to understand that this transform needs to take place. And this is how you get the effect where the particles float around in world space. Now, there was an issue that I had with a sword, which I guess I'll just draw it here, not for any particular reason, but we had that sword again, right? And the sword, for some reason, all of the particles were stuck to it. Well, again, was you started using the local space of the volume, which is actually aligned with the object space of the sword in this case. And in the shader, I would do the conversion to world space for each particle. So that was interesting, and it gave this effect where the particles were stuck to it, but it didn't allow them to float away because the particles were always encapsulated in this volume, even as the volume traversed, through world space. So some interesting little problems and things to work on. I didn't find a lot online about it, so maybe I'm messing things up. And I know with particle systems, there are just an infinite number of things you can do and optimizations, and I think you can completely use a GPU for particles, if I'm not mistaken. But for now, with instance rendering and all of that, I think it's pretty good for a prototype. But anyways, if you made it this far, thank you for watching, and take care.